The wind slipped through the broken edges of the old warehouse like a thief, stealing what little warmth the night tried to offer. Sana pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked down at her two children curled beside her on flattened cardboard boxes. Their breaths came out in soft white clouds, fading into the darkness. "We'll sleep in the cold tonight," she whispered, more to herself than to them. Her voice trembled, but she forced a small smile when her daughter looked up. "It's okay, Mama," little Ariba said bravely, though her tiny hands were stiff with cold. "I'll pretend it's snow." Sana swallowed the ache in her throat. Snow was beautiful in stories. Here, in the abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city, cold was cruel and sharp. She hadn't imagined life would unravel this way. A year ago, she had a small rented room, a sewing machine, and a husband who promised he would find steady work. But promises don't always survive reality. When illness took him suddenly, debts followed like shadows. The landlord was patient for a while, neighbors offered sympathy, but sympathy doesn't pay rent. Eventually, she and her children found themselves carrying their lives in two worn-out bags, stepping into the uncertainty of the streets. The warehouse became their shelter by accident. One rainy evening, with nowhere else to go, she had pushed open its rusted door and found emptiness instead of danger. Since then, it had been their refuge from rain and watchful eyes. But winter had arrived early this year. Sana rubbed her son Hamza's arms, trying to warm him. He was only 5, too young to understand why his home had no walls and his bed had no blanket. He stirred and mumbled in his sleep. Footsteps echoed outside. Sana froze. At this hour, footsteps meant trouble more often than help. She pulled her children closer and listened as the sound grew louder, crunching against gravel. The door creaked open. A tall figure stood in the doorway, backlit by the faint yellow of a distant street lamp. For a moment, fear rooted her to the ground. "I'm sorry," a man's voice said gently. "I didn't know anyone was inside." Sana said nothing. She had learned that silence was sometimes safer than words. The man stepped inside slowly, his hands visible. He looked to be in his early 30s, wearing a worn jacket and carrying a toolbox. His face was tired but not unkind. "I come here sometimes after work," he explained. "It's quiet." His eyes adjusted to the darkness and landed on the children. His expression changed. "You have kids?" Sana nodded stiffly. He looked around at the cardboard beds, the thin shawl, the emptiness. The wind swept in again, making the children shiver. "We'll sleep in the cold tonight," Sana said quietly, her pride forcing her to speak before he could offer pity. "We've done it before." The man stood still for a long moment. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice as if making a promise. "Not while I'm here." She didn't understand what he meant until he set down his toolbox and shrugged off his heavy jacket, placing it gently over Hamza. The boy stirred, curling instinctively into the unexpected warmth. "It's not enough," Sana protested weakly. "Wait," he said, already turning toward the door. "I live nearby." Before she could respond, he disappeared into the night. Sana's heart pounded with uncertainty. She had learned not to trust easily. Help often came with conditions she couldn't afford. But 20 minutes later, the door opened again. The man returned, this time carrying 2 thick blankets and a thermos. His breath was uneven as though he had run. "My name is Ibrahim," he said simply, kneeling to spread one blanket over the children and handing the other to Sana. "I brought tea. It's hot." Sana stared at him, disbelief softening into something fragile and unfamiliar, hope. "Why?" she asked. Ibrahim hesitated. "Because I know what cold feels like." He didn't explain further, and she didn't ask. She poured the tea into the thermos lid and held it to her daughter's lips. Ariba sighed at the warmth. That night, for the first time in weeks, the wind did not feel victorious. The next evening, Ibrahim returned. Sana half expected the previous night to have been an exception, a moment of fleeting kindness. but he came back carrying a small electric heater. "There's a power line still active at the back," he explained. "I'm an electrician, I checked." Within minutes, a faint orange glow filled the corner of the warehouse. It wasn't much, but it pushed back the biting cold. "You don't have to keep doing this," Sana said, watching him work. "I know," he replied. "I want to." Over the following days, Ibrahim became a quiet presence in their lives. He brought groceries one evening, a bag of fresh bread another. He found a discarded wooden pallet and fashioned it into a makeshift bed to lift the children off the concrete floor. Sana learned that he lived alone in a tiny rented room not far from there. He worked long hours fixing wiring in old buildings. He sent most of his earnings to his mother in the village. "I used to sleep in places like this," he admitted one night as they shared tea. "After my father passed away, we lost everything. I remember my mother telling me we'd be fine, even when we were." Sana looked at him differently then, not as a stranger, but as someone who carried the same scars. Still, pride lingered. "I don't want to be a burden," she said softly. "You're not," he answered firmly. "Everyone needs someone sometimes." Days turned into weeks. Ibrahim began asking around about sewing work for Sana. He spoke to shopkeepers and tailors, mentioning her skills. One afternoon, he arrived with a second-hand sewing machine balanced carefully in his arms. "I fixed it," he said with a shy smile. "It works." Sana's hands trembled as she touched it. It felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Soon, small jobs began trickling in, hemming trousers, stitching simple dresses, repairing torn uniforms. Sana worked late into the night under a borrowed lamp, her fingers moving with renewed purpose. The warehouse no longer felt like the end of the road. It felt temporary. One evening, as Sana finished stitching a school uniform, she looked up to find Ibrahim watching the children play. "You've done enough," she told him quietly. "We'll manage now." He smiled, but there was something uncertain in his eyes. "I didn't do this so I could leave." Her heart skipped. "Ibrahim." "I'm not asking for anything," he interrupted gently. "I just care." Sana had built walls around her heart after losing her husband. Grief and survival had left little space for anything else, but kindness has a way of slipping through cracks. She thought of the night he had stepped into the warehouse, when cold felt unbearable and hope felt foolish. "We'll sleep in the cold tonight," she had said. And he had answered, "Not while I'm here." Those words had not been grand or dramatic. They had been steady, reliable. Weeks later, with savings from her sewing and Ibrahim's help, Sana found a small, single-room apartment. The walls were cracked, the paint peeling, but it had a door that locked and windows that closed. The night they moved in, Ariba spun in circles, laughing. Hamza jumped onto the thin mattress placed against the wall. Sana stood in the center of the room, overwhelmed. Ibrahim placed the last bag down and looked around. "It's not much." "It's everything," she whispered. That evening, they sat on the floor eating simple rice and lentils. The room was warm, not because of a heater or blankets, but because of what had grown between them. "I don't know how to thank you," Sana said. "You already have," Ibrahim replied, nodding toward the children. "Seeing them smile is enough." Silence settled, comfortable this time. Sana took a slow breath. "You said you didn't do this to leave." He met her eyes. "I don't want you to," she continued, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "If you're willing, maybe we don't have to face things alone anymore." Ibrahim didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for her hand, his grip warm and certain. "I've been alone a long time," he said. "I'd like that." Outside, the wind howled against the building, but inside, the small room held firm. Winter stretched on, but it no longer felt like an enemy. Sana's sewing business slowly grew. Ibrahim continued his work, sometimes bringing home small treats for the children, a chocolate bar, a storybook rescued from a repair job. Life wasn't perfect. There were still bills to worry about, long days, unexpected setbacks. But there was also laughter, shared meals, and the quiet strength of partnership. One particularly cold night, months later, the power went out across the neighborhood. Darkness swallowed the room, and Ariba's voice piped up anxiously. "Are we going to be cold again?" Sana opened her mouth to reassure her, but Ibrahim spoke first, lighting a small lantern. "Not while I'm here," he said with a wink. The children giggled. Sana watched him, her heart full in a way she hadn't thought possible after so much loss. She realized then that warmth isn't always about heaters or blankets. Sometimes it's about someone choosing to stand beside you when the world feels unkind. That first night in the warehouse could have been just another chapter of hardship. Instead, it became the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Because sometimes, when someone whispers that they'll endure the cold alone, all it takes is one steady voice answering back. "Not while I'm here."